In the small town of Brunswick, what began as an ordinary morning for Bill Harrison, an 84-year-old veteran, quickly turned into the start of something far greater. When Bill walked into a cafe for breakfast, he never imagined that a simple act of refusing to leave after being told he wasn't welcome would spark a movement. Quiet but unyielding, Bill took a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. What no one saw coming was the unexpected allies who would join him, a group of bikers sitting in the corner, and a crowd that soon gathered outside. As tensions rise, the entire town is forced to confront the deep-seated issues they've long ignored. But will Bill's defiance inspire the change Brunswick desperately needs, or will it push the town to a breaking point? What would you do if you were in Bill's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're ready to follow this gripping journey of courage and community, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. The morning sun crept gently over the horizon, casting soft rays through the lace curtains of Bill Harrison's modest home in Brunswick. At 84, Bill moved slowly, deliberately, but each action was a mark of precision, an echo of his military past. His weathered hands, covered in liver spots and deep wrinkles, moved with care as he buttoned up his shirt, pulling it taut over his chest. It was Sunday, and Sundays meant breakfast out, a ritual he had never outgrown. Bill glanced in the mirror, a fleeting ghost of a younger version of himself staring back. His reflection showed not just age but the weight of years spent fighting battles, some on foreign soil, others on the streets of his own country. His eyes, slightly clouded with cataracts, still held a glimmer of the young soldier he once was, a soldier who had believed that his sacrifice would help build a better world. His routine was comforting, but today was different. Marcy's Diner, his usual haunt, was closed for renovations. He felt a pang of disappointment as he tied his shoes, the quiet banter of Marcy and her regulars absent from his day. For years, Marcy's had been his safe haven, a place where people knew him, respected him. He had formed a bond with her, a plucky woman in her late 50s who always had his coffee ready by the time he sat down. She was one of the few who treated him like family, never asking questions about deeper things, but offering a kind of companionship that kept his loneliness at bay. But today, he had to venture somewhere new, the Oakside Cafe, a small, cozy restaurant on the other side of town. He had heard whispers about its home-style cooking, though he had never been before. He had always preferred the familiar comfort of Marcy's. But change, Bill had learned, was unavoidable. As he stepped out of his house, the crisp autumn air hit his face. He breathed it in deeply, savoring the clean scent of fallen leaves mixed with the distant smell of chimney smoke. The town of Brunswick was still waking up. The streets were quiet, lined with houses much like his, old, well-kept, filled with memories. He passed by Willie Jefferson, an elderly white neighbor who gave him a nod as they had done every Sunday for years. Willie's nod wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either, just the acknowledgement of two men who had lived through the same war but different battles. As Bill walked, his mind drifted back to his time in the military. Those were different days. There was a certain brotherhood in the service, but even there, he had been reminded constantly that his skin made him different. He thought about the day he enlisted, so full of pride and hope. His mother had cried, but she had understood. She knew her son had to go, even if it meant leaving everything behind. He remembered how, in the barracks, he was often segregated from the white soldiers. But when the bullets started flying, color didn't seem to matter as much. He had saved lives, and others had saved him. That's what made the quiet racism of Brunswick sting all the more deeply. He had fought for this country, sacrificed so much, yet still found himself greeted with cold stares and forced smiles in a town where prejudice simmered beneath the surface. He had been back home for decades now, yet the battle for respect never really ended. He crossed Main Street, passing by the local bakery and the hardware store. A few people waved and he nodded back, polite but detached. His heart ached a little when he saw a group of kids playing in front of the candy store, reminding him of his own grandchildren who lived miles away in Atlanta. They visited when they could, but life kept them busy. It wasn't their fault. Time and distance had a way of creating invisible walls. Finally, Bill reached Oakside Cafe. Its front windows gleamed in the early light, reflecting the quiet street. A wooden sign swung gently in the breeze, with the words, "Oakside Cafe, where everyone's welcome," painted in elegant script. Bill hoped that sentiment was more than just a slogan. He pushed the door open, and the small bell above chimed softly, announcing his arrival. The warm scent of coffee, bacon, and eggs hit Bill as soon as he stepped inside, stirring his appetite. The cafe was cozy, with soft yellow lights casting a comfortable glow over the wooden tables and mismatched chairs. A handful of people sat scattered around the room, families enjoying breakfast, couples chatting over mugs of steaming coffee, and a few solo diners absorbed in their newspapers. In the far corner, a group of burly men wearing leather jackets sat around a table, their laughter ringing out occasionally. Bill eyed them curiously. They looked tough, but there was a camaraderie between them that felt familiar, something he recognized from his own military days. Bill stood for a moment, taking it all in. The place was homey, the kind of place that could become a regular spot if he left it. The tension he had been carrying since leaving home started to ease, just a little. A young waitress with a bright smile approached him. Her name tag read Kelly, and she couldn't have been more than 25. Her blonde hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her eyes sparkled with warmth. She reminded him of his granddaughter, sweet, polite, and full of promise. "Good morning, sir," she greeted him. "Would you like a booth or a seat at the counter?" Bill's eyes darted around the cafe. He noticed a few empty tables and booths near the window. He liked sitting by the window, where he could watch the town slowly wake up. "A booth, please," he replied, his voice gruff but polite. "If that's all right." "Right this way," Kelly said, leading him to a cozy booth by the window. As Bill sat down, the vinyl seat creaked beneath him, adding to the homey atmosphere. Kelly handed him a menu, worn from years of use but still legible. "I'll be right back with your coffee," she said, flashing him another smile before heading to the counter. Bill scanned the menu, though he already knew what he wanted. He was a simple man with simple tastes: scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and a side of hash browns. As he waited, he sipped the coffee that Kelly brought over, its rich aroma filling the air. He felt his shoulders relaxed a little more. Maybe Oakside Cafe wasn't so bad after all. But just as he began to let his guard down, the kitchen door swung open and a man emerged. He was tall and stocky, with a shaved head that gleamed under the cafe's soft lights. His eyes, however, were sharp and cold, scanning the room like a hawk. This, Bill assumed, must be Lenny Davis, the owner. Lenny's gaze swept across the cafe, nodding at the regulars, offering brief smiles to families and couples. But when his eyes landed on Bill, the smile vanished, replaced by a scowl. Bill felt the change in the air immediately. The warmth of the cafe seemed to drain away in an instant. It was a look Bill had seen too many times before. It said without words, "You don't belong here." Bill's hand tightened around his coffee cup, the warmth of the ceramic grounding him in the moment. He had faced worse in his life than an unfriendly cafe owner, but the weight of years, of fighting for respect, of being reminded over and over that he was seen as less, settled heavy on his chest. He considered leaving, avoiding the confrontation he could feel brewing. But a lifetime of standing his ground, of fighting for his place in spaces where others thought he didn't belong, kept him rooted to his seat. Kelly returned with a pad and pen in hand. "Are you ready to order, sir?" she asked brightly, oblivious to the tension that had thickened the air. Bill smiled up at her, appreciating her warmth. "I'll have the scrambled eggs, bacon, and hash browns, and maybe a side of toast." Kelly jotted down his order and gave him a cheerful nod. "Excellent choice. I'll get that in for you right away." As she walked away, Bill took another sip of coffee, trying to focus on the comfort of the familiar flavors. But Lenny's presence lingered like a dark cloud. Bill could feel the man's eyes on him, even as he disappeared back into the kitchen. A murmur of voices rose from behind the swinging doors, their tone urgent, maybe even heated. Bill braced himself, knowing from long experience that the calm before the storm was often the hardest part to endure. Bill's mind wandered as he waited for his food, his thoughts drifting back to a time long ago, before his skin had wrinkled and his joints had stiffened. Back to when he was a young man, full of hope, eager to serve his country. He remembered the pride he had felt donning his uniform for the first time, the belief that he was fighting for something greater than himself. He also remembered the prejudice, the way he had been treated as less, even in the service. There were always those who made it clear they didn't think a black man had any business wearing the same uniform as them. But there were also those who stood by him, men who didn't care about the color of his skin when they were in the heat of battle. Those men were his brothers, and he would never forget them. The sound of the kitchen door swinging open snapped Bill back to the present. Lenny emerged again, his face set in a hard mask of determination. He walked straight toward Bill's booth, each step deliberate, the tension in the room rising with every footfall. Bill felt his stomach tight. He knew what was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. Lenny stopped in front of Bill's table, crossing his arms over his chest. "We're full up today," he said, his voice gruff, the words sharp and cold. "You'll have to leave." Bill blinked, momentarily taken aback by the blatant lie. He glanced around the cafe, noting several empty tables and open spots at the counter. His heart sank, but he forced himself to meet Lenny's gaze steadily. "I'm sorry," Bill said, his voice calm but firm, "but there seems to be plenty of open seats. Is there a problem?" Lenny's expression hardened. "I said we're full," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." Bill's stomach dropped. He had faced this kind of discrimination before, but it didn't hurt any less now than it had when he was younger. The same old battle, the same old hatred. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, his fingers tightening around the handle of his coffee cup. "I'm not looking for trouble," Bill said quietly. "I just want to have my breakfast." But Lenny wasn't interested in a peaceful resolution, his face twisted with anger, his voice growing louder. "Your kind isn't welcome here," he snapped, his words cutting through the air like a knife. The cafe fell silent. All eyes turned toward Bill and Lenny, the other patrons frozen in shock or discomfort. Bill felt the weight of their stares, the judgment, the quiet approval of some and the silent disapproval of others. Bill sat for a moment, absorbing the sting of Lenny's words. It wasn't just the bigotry that hurt. It was the ease with which Lenny had dismissed him, the casual cruelty of a man who saw Bill's humanity as something lesser. In the far corner of the cafe, the group of bikers shifted in their seats. Their leader, a tall, graying man named Tom Jennings, watched the scene unfold with narrowed eyes. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze, a brewing storm of anger that simmered just below the surface. Bill glanced toward them, unsure of what to expect. He had long ago learned not to judge people by their appearance, but he also knew that these situations could escalate quickly and he didn't want anyone to get hurt. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "I've served this country for over 30 years," he said, his voice low but carrying across the room. "All I'm asking for is the same respect anyone else would get." Lenny's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Tom stood up from his table, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath as Tom's question hung in the air, the tension reaching a boiling point. The cafe fell into a tense silence as Tom Jennings, the leader of the bikers, stood tall and firm, his question hanging in the air. Bill, still standing by his booth, felt a surge of emotions he had grown all too familiar with: anger, sadness, weariness. But today, there was something else, a flicker of hope. Tom's calm voice carried a weight of authority, and for a moment, Bill felt the room shift. Lenny, caught off guard, looked visibly rattled. His bravado faltered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. His face flushed red with anger as his eyes darted around the cafe, landing on the other patrons as if seeking support. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact, but no one spoke up. Most people just stared, waiting to see what would happen next. "I told him we're full," Lenny barked, his voice rising, trying to regain control of the situation. He pointed a shaky finger at Bill, his tone laced with desperation. "I can refuse service to anyone, and I'm asking him to leave." Tom didn't flinch. His steel blue eyes remained locked on Lenny, unmoved by the owner's growing hysteria. Behind him, the other bikers began to rise one by one. Their leather jackets and rough appearances sent a ripple of unease through the cafe, but they stood quietly, calmly, like soldiers awaiting orders. "We're not here to cause trouble," Tom said evenly, his deep voice carrying across the room. "But this man here," he nodded toward Bill, "he's a veteran, just like us. He served this country. He deserves respect, and he sure as hell deserves to eat his breakfast in peace." Lenny's eyes widened as he looked from Tom to Bill and back again. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead, and his mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He was outnumbered, and he knew it. His hands balled into fists at his sides, and for a moment it seemed like he might try to argue further. But the collective gaze of the bikers bore down on him, and his bravado finally crumbled. Bill, still standing with his military ID in hand, watched the exchange with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him, much less a group of rough-looking bikers. But here they were, and they had made their position clear. Lenny took a step back, his face twisting with anger and humiliation. "Fine," he spat, "but don't think for a second that I'm letting this go. You don't belong here, none of you." The words stung, but Bill had heard worse in his lifetime. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He didn't need to respond. Tom's presence, the solidarity of the bikers, spoke louder than anything he could have said. With a final glare at Bill and the bikers, Lenny turned on his heel and stormed back into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the cafe like a gunshot, and for a moment, no one moved. The tension hung thick in the air, as if everyone was waiting for what would happen next. Tom turned to Bill, his expression softening. "You are all right, sir?" he asked, his voice gentle now, a far cry from the commanding tone he had used with Lenny. Bill nodded slowly, still processing the events that had just unfolded. I'm fine," he managed to say. "Thank you. I didn't expect—" He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect anyone to step in like that." Tom smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't have to fight these battles alone, sir. Not anymore." The other bikers murmured their agreement, and Bill felt a lump form in his throat. It had been a long time since he had felt this kind of camaraderie, this kind of support. For so long, he had fought these battles quietly, with dignity, but alone. Now here were these men, strangers really, standing by him, ready to fight for him if needed. Kelly, the young waitress, stood frozen near the counter, her eyes wide with shock. She had been watching the entire scene unfold, and now she approached Bill cautiously, her face pale. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know he was going to." "It's all right," Bill interrupted gently, offering her a small smile. "It's not your fault." Kelly nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Your breakfast is on the house," she said quickly. "Please don't leave. Let me get it for you." Bill hesitated, glancing at Tom and the bikers. He wasn't sure if he could stay. The air in the cafe still felt thick with tension, and the humiliation he had felt moments ago still weighed heavily on him. Tom seemed to sense his hesitation. "If you want to stay, we'll stay with you," he said firmly. "If not, we'll walk out with you. Your call, sir." Bill considered the offer for a moment. The cafe had fallen into an uneasy silence, the other patrons watching, waiting. His appetite had all but disappeared, but something inside him, the soldier, the fighter, urged him to stay. He had done nothing wrong. He had a right to be here just like anyone else. "I'll stay," Bill said finally, his voice steady. "But only if you all stay too." Tom grinned, his rough features softening. "Then we'll stay." Bill sat back down in his booth, his back straight, his heart pounding. Tom and the other bikers returned to their table, but their presence in the cafe was unmistakable, a silent, powerful statement that they were there for him. Kelly quickly disappeared into the kitchen, and within minutes she returned with Bill's breakfast: scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and golden hash browns, just the way he liked it. She placed the plate in front of him with shaky hands, her face flushed with embarrassment over what had happened earlier. Bill picked up his fork, but before he could take a bite, the kitchen door swung open again. Lenny re-emerged, but this time he wasn't alone. He was followed by 2 local police officers, their faces grim. The lead officer, Officer Daniels, was a middle-aged man with graying hair at his temples, his expression a mix of professionalism and discomfort as he surveyed the scene. His partner, a younger officer named Officer Blake, stood slightly behind him, his hand resting casually near his belt, as if unsure what to expect. The cafe had gone utterly silent, every eye trained on the 2 policemen as they approached Bill's table. Officer Daniels stopped in front of Bill, glancing briefly at Lenny, who was standing just behind the officers, his arms crossed over his chest, and a smug expression creeping onto his face. "Is there a problem here?" Daniels asked, his voice calm but laced with the kind of authority that came from years on the job. He didn't look directly at Bill as he spoke, but rather at the whole room, as if trying to assess the situation from the collective mood of the patrons. Before Bill could respond, Lenny jumped in. "Yeah, there's a problem," he said quickly, his voice laced with vindication. "This man refuses to leave my cafe after I asked him to. He's causing a disturbance." Bill blinked, momentarily stunned by the lie. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene, but the implication was clear. The accusation hung in the air like a bad smell. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Tom Jennings stood up from his table. "With all due respect, officer," Tom said, his voice calm but firm, "there's been no disturbance here. This man, Bill, he was just sitting here trying to eat his breakfast when the owner told him to leave for no reason." The officers turned to face Tom, their eyes narrowing slightly as they took in the imposing figure of the biker leader. Tom remained calm, his hands at his sides, but his presence alone demanded attention. Behind him, the other bikers stood as well, a show of solidarity that made the tension in the room even more palpable. Officer Daniels frowned, looking between Lenny, Bill, and Tom. "Mr. Harrison," he said, addressing Bill directly for the first time. "Is that true?" Bill took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had been in situations like this before. and he knew how quickly they could spiral out of control. His heart pounded in his chest, but he met Officer Daniels' gaze evenly. "Yes, officer," Bill said, his voice calm but firm. "I came here this morning to have breakfast, just like anyone else. I was sitting here minding my own business when Mr. Davis," he nodded toward Lenny, "told me I had to leave. He said the cafe was full, but as you can see, there are plenty of empty seats." Daniels glanced around the cafe, clearly noting the empty tables and booths. His frown deepened and he turned to Lenny. "Is that true?" Lenny's face flushed with anger. "I reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," he said, his voice rising. "It's my business. I don't have to explain myself." Officer Daniels sighed, clearly displeased with the situation, but unwilling to jump to conclusions. He gestured for Lenny to step aside and motioned for Bill to stay seated. "All right, let's take a step back here," Daniels said, his voice measured. "We don't need this to turn into something bigger than it is." But it was already big. Bill could feel the eyes of everyone in the cafe on him, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. He could sense the other patrons shifting in their seats, some uncomfortable, others curious to see how things would unfold. And then there were those, a few scattered at various tables, who looked almost satisfied with the situation. People who agreed with Lenny, silently endorsing his actions with their complicit stares. Bill's mind raced. He had two options: let this go, leave quietly, and avoid making waves, or stand his ground. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that standing up for himself wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. It was about every other person who had been turned away, belittled, or told they didn't belong simply because of the color of their skin. Before Bill could speak again, Tom stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Officer," he said, addressing Daniels, "we're not here to cause trouble. We're veterans, all of us, and Bill here has earned the same respect as any other man in this town. He served his country. He has a right to sit here and eat his breakfast just like anyone else." Daniel's expression shifted slightly as he registered what Tom was saying. His gaze flickered to the military patches on the bikers' jackets, and then to Bill, who sat quietly, his military ID still resting on the table next to his plate. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of understanding in Daniel's eyes. Lenny, however, wasn't done. "I don't care if he's a veteran or not," Lenny spat, his voice growing more agitated. "This is my cafe, and I decide who gets to eat here." The younger officer, Blake, stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Sir," he said, addressing Lenny, "you need to calm down." Lenny's face flushed an even deeper shade of red, but before he could respond, Officer Daniels held up a hand, signaling for everyone to stop. "Let's settle this right here," Daniels said, his voice firm but steady. "Mr. Davis, you may have the right to refuse service, but the way this is playing out, it's looking a lot like discrimination. Now I suggest we all take a breath and think this through." For a moment, no one moved. The silence was thick, the tension crackling in the air. Bill sat in his booth, his hands resting gently on the table, his eyes on Daniels. He could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind, could sense that Daniels didn't want this to escalate any further. Finally, Daniels turned to Bill. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice gentler now, "if you're comfortable staying, I'll make sure you get to finish your meal in peace. If you want to leave, you're free to do that too. It's your choice." Bill considered the officer's words. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the eyes of the other patrons watching, waiting to see what he would do. He could walk out, leave all of this behind, and avoid any more confrontation. But deep down, he knew that leaving wouldn't change anything. Walking away would only reinforce the idea that he didn't belong, that people like him didn't have a right to be here. "I'll stay," Bill said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Daniels nodded, clearly relieved. "All right," he said. "Let's all calm down and go about our business." But Lenny wasn't having it. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "You can't just—" "Enough, Mr. Davis," Daniels cut him off, his voice stern now. "You've made your point. Let the man eat his breakfast, or I'll have to report this as a civil rights violation." Lenny's face twisted with rage, but he said nothing. He glared at Bill, at Tom, and at the bikers who had come to Bill's defense, but in the end, he stomped back toward the kitchen, muttering under his breath. As the door swung shut behind him, the cafe slowly came back to life. The tension didn't completely dissipate, but it lessened as the other patrons returned to their meals, some casting furtive glances at Bill and the bikers, others pretending as if nothing had happened. Bill sat in silence for a moment, staring down at his plate. The food in front of him had gone cold and his appetite was long gone. But there was a quiet victory in his heart. He had stood on his ground. And for the first time in a long time, he hadn't had to fight that battle alone. The bikers returned to their seats, their presence still commanding, but now more subdued. Tom gave Bill a nod, a small gesture of respect, and Bill returned it. He couldn't find the words to express his gratitude, but he knew Tom understood. In the way of soldiers, in the way of men who had fought and bled and sacrificed for something bigger than themselves, no words were needed. Bill took a bite of his now cold breakfast, not for the taste, but for the principle. The scrambled eggs were tasteless in his mouth, but every bite felt like a victory. He didn't eat much, just enough to make his point. When he was finished, he carefully placed his fork down and wiped his mouth with the napkin. His heart was still pounding, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly fading, leaving him feeling both exhausted and strangely uplifted. Kelly, the young waitress, returned to his table, her face still pale but her expression one of quiet determination. "Is there anything else I can get for you, Mr. Harrison?" she asked softly, her voice filled with an apology she couldn't quite bring herself to say out loud. Bill shook his head, offering her a small smile. "No, thank you, Kelly," he said gently. "You've been kind." Kelly's eyes flickered with gratitude and relief, and she quickly cleared his plate, bustling away to the kitchen with a renewed sense of purpose. Bill watched her go, feeling a strange sense of hope. Maybe she was the future, a generation that could see past skin color and division. Tom and the bikers lingered near the door as Bill slowly stood up, adjusting his jacket. He knew this wasn't over. Lenny would hold a grudge and some in the town would see Bill's stand as a provocation. But others, people like Tom, Kelly, and perhaps some of the silent patrons, might see it as something else, a step forward. As Bill walked toward the door, Tom stepped forward. "You need anything, sir?" he asked quietly. "Anything at all? You just let us know." Bill paused, his hand on the door handle, and looked up at Tom. The biker's grizzled face was serious, but there was kindness in his eyes. Bill nodded slowly. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I truly do." With a final nod, Bill pushed open the door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The sun had risen higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet street. As he stood there for a moment, breathing in the fresh air, he realized that something had shifted both in the town and within himself. The battle wasn't over. There would always be more to fight. But today, at least, he had won one small victory, and he hadn't done it alone. As Bill stepped out of the Oakside Cafe, the cold morning air hit his face, a stark contrast to the heavy tension he had just endured inside. He paused for a moment, letting the sun warm his skin, but his heart was still heavy. The battle may have been won for the day, but he knew all too well that this wouldn't be the last confrontation. Even so, He had chosen to stay, to stand on his ground, and that decision filled him with a sense of pride. Bill started down the street, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He noticed a few people on the sidewalks who had likely heard about the cafe incident. Some nodded at him as he passed, their eyes carrying a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Others avoided eye contact entirely, pretending they hadn't seen him at all. It was a stark reminder of the division that still ran through Brunswick, just beneath its quaint small-town charm. As he walked, Bill couldn't help but think back to his early days after the war. He had returned home full of hope and determination, expecting that the country he had fought for would welcome him with open arms. But instead, he had been met with the same old prejudice, the same deep-rooted hatred that had plagued his youth. He had hoped that things would be different now, but it seemed that in some places, time had barely moved. He made his way to the park at the center of town, a quiet spot where he often went to clear his head. The leaves had begun to turn, bright oranges and reds painting the trees in a vibrant display of autumn. Bill sat down on a weathered bench, his eyes scanning the peaceful scene before him. Children were playing on the swings, their laughter ringing through the air, and a few elderly couples walked hand in hand along the path. Life went on, despite the turmoil that had unfolded just a short while ago. Bill took a deep breath, trying to let go of the frustration gnawing at him. He knew that what had happened in the cafe was just one battle in a much larger war, a war he had been fighting for most of his life. But the weight of it was heavy, especially at his age. He was tired of having to prove himself over and over again. Just then, a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. "Bill?" Bill looked up to see Reverend Samuel Harris, the pastor of the local church, walking toward him. Samuel was a tall, kind-hearted man in his late 50s with graying hair and a calm demeanor. He had been a friend to Bill for years, and he had always been one of the few people in town who spoke openly about the need for racial unity. "Morning, Reverend," Bill said, offering a tired smile as the pastor sat down beside him on the bench. "I heard about what happened at the cafe," Samuel said quietly, his eyes filled with concern. "How are you holding up?" Bill sighed, glancing out at the park again. "I'm fine, Sam. It's not the first time, and I doubt it'll be the last." Samuel nodded, his expression grim. "It's a damn shame it is what it is, after all you've done for this town, for this country." Bill gave a bitter chuckle. "Doesn't seem to matter much to some folks, does it?" The Reverend placed a hand on Bill's shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "You did the right thing, Bill. Standing your ground like that, it's important. People need to see that. They need to see that it's not just about you. It's about all of us. About this town coming to terms with its past and moving forward." Bill nodded, but he couldn't help the creeping sense of doubt that settled in his chest. "I don't know, Sam. Sometimes it feels like we've been fighting the same fight for so long, and nothing's really changed." Samuel's eyes softened, and he leaned in slightly. "I know it feels that way, but don't lose hope. Change takes time. You're planting seeds, Bill. You may not see them grow, but others will. People like you, standing up to men like Lenny Davis, it matters." Bill sat in silence for a moment, letting Samuel's words sink in. He wanted to believe it. He truly did. But decades of disappointment had left him cautious, wary of getting his hopes up. Before either of them could speak again, a young couple walked past, both of them nodding at Bill with quiet respect. "Morning, Mr. Harrison," the man said, his tone sincere. Bill nodded back, his heart lifting just a little. Maybe Reverend Harris was right. Maybe things were starting to change, even if it was slow and painful. The day after the incident at Oakside Cafe, Brunswick was buzzing with gossip. Word spread fast in small towns, and by noon, nearly everyone knew about what had happened between Bill and Lenny. Some townsfolk were shocked by Lenny's blatant display of prejudice. Others, though not surprised, were still quietly appalled by the public nature of the altercation. Bill stayed home most of the day, but when he ventured out in the afternoon to buy a newspaper at the corner shop, he could feel the eyes on him. People didn't say much, but they didn't need to. Their gazes, their whispers told him all he needed to know. As he walked down Main Street, Bill passed by a small group of townspeople gathered outside the general store. He recognized some of them: Judy Thompson, a longtime resident and one of the local school teachers, and Pete Harlow, the owner of the auto repair shop. They were deep in conversation, and Bill caught fragments of their discussion as he passed. "It's just not right what Lenny did," Judy was saying, her voice hushed but indignant. "Bill Harrison has been a part of this community for decades. He's done more for this town than most people even realize." Pete frowned, crossing his arms over his chest. "I don't disagree, but you know how Lenny is. He's always had that chip on his shoulder, especially when it comes to race. It's ugly, but some folks in this town, they think like him. That's the sad truth." Judy shook her head, her voice growing more impassioned. "Well, it's time for that to change. I've got students, black students, who deserve to feel like they belong here. And it's not going to happen if we let people like Lenny get away with this kind of behavior." Bill kept walking, not wanting to linger and be drawn into the conversation, but their words echoed in his mind. There were people in Brunswick who cared, people who wanted things to be different. Maybe Reverend Harris was right. Maybe there was still hope for change. But as Bill rounded the corner, his optimism faltered. Standing in front of the post office was a group of men, including Jim Wilcox, one of Lenny's close friends. They were muttering to one another, their eyes following Bill as he walked by. Jim was a large man, with a perpetual scowl etched onto his face, and he had never hidden his dislike for Bill. "Morning, Harrison," Jim called out, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Bill didn't respond, keeping his head high as he continued walking. He could feel their eyes on him, could hear their low, mocking laughter behind him. The divide in the town was clear. Some were ready to move forward, but others were determined to cling to the past. Later that afternoon, Bill received an unexpected phone call from Tom Jennings, the leader of the bikers who had come to his defense at Oakside Cafe. The phone rang in its usual slow rhythm, and Bill hesitated for a moment before picking up the receiver. "Hello?" He answered, his voice still steady despite the events of the past day. "Bill, it's Tom Jennings," came the gruff but friendly voice on the other end of the line. "I've been thinking about what happened at the cafe. My guys and we've been talking, and we don't think this can just end here." Bill frowned slightly, not quite sure what Tom meant. "What do you have in mind?" "Peaceful protest," Tom said without hesitation. "We want to show Lenny and the rest of the town that what happened wasn't right. We're not looking to start trouble, but we need to make a stand. For you, for all of us." The words sent a jolt through Bill's chest. He had spent his whole life standing up in quiet ways, but a public protest? It was more than he had imagined. Still, something in him stirred a deep old urge to fight back against injustice, not just for himself, but for the generations coming after him. "Are you sure this is the right move?" Bill asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "I don't want anyone getting hurt over this." Tom chuckled softly, though there was steel in his tone. "We're not looking for a fight, Bill. We're looking for change, and sometimes the only way to make that happen is to get people's attention. We're not talking about violence. We're talking about showing the town that we stand together no matter what." Bill was silent for a long moment, thinking. He had always believed in quiet resistance, in maintaining his dignity and fighting battles on his own terms. But this was something bigger, and maybe, just maybe, It was time for him to step into the spotlight. "All right," Bill said finally, his voice filled with resolve. "I'll be there." The plan was set. Tom and the bikers would organize a peaceful protest outside Oakside Cafe the following morning, and they would invite others in the community to join them. Bill wasn't sure what to expect, whether the town would rally behind them or if they would face more opposition, but one thing was certain: things were about to change. As Bill hung up the phone, he stared out the window, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The town was quiet, but he could feel the tension building beneath the surface, ready to burst open. The next day would be a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire town of Brunswick. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Bill Harrison rose early, as was his habit, though this day felt different. There was tension in the air, not just in his house, but in the town of Brunswick itself. The events of the previous day still weighed heavily on his mind, but today something more hung over him, a sense of anticipation, of change in the making. Bill dressed carefully, choosing his usual neatly pressed slacks and a button-down shirt. He moved slowly, his old joints protesting, but his mind was sharp, focused. He reached for his military jacket, the one adorned with the medals he had earned during his years of service. As he slipped it on, he felt the familiar weight of it, not just on his shoulders, but in his heart. Today, he wasn't just going to be a man quietly standing up for himself. He was going to stand up for something bigger, for his entire community. As he buttoned the last button of his jacket, he glanced in the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, weathered and lined with age, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't dimmed. He was ready. The protest was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. outside Oakside Cafe. Tom Jennings and his crew of bikers had spread the word throughout the town, and Bill wasn't sure how many people would show up or what kind of reception they would receive. Brunswick wasn't known for protests, peaceful or otherwise, and the thought of standing in the center of such a public display made Bill's stomach churn with a mix of nerves and determination. At 9:30, a loud rumble reached Bill's ears from outside. He moved to the window and saw Tom's biker gang pulling up in front of his house, their motorcycles gleaming in the morning sun. Tom had promised to give Bill a ride to the protest, and as he watched the bikers roll in, Bill couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. These men, rough around the edges, grizzled and tough, had stood by him when no one else had. And today, they were standing with him again. Tom climbed off his bike and knocked on Bill's door. When Bill opened it, Tom greeted him with a broad, reassuring grin. "You ready, Bill?" he asked, his voice warm but serious. Bill nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. "Ready as I'll ever be." They stepped outside together, the cool air bracing. Tom handed Bill a spare helmet and helped him onto the back of his bike. Bill wasn't used to riding motorcycles. His military days had been spent on foot or in jeeps, but he felt a strange sense of comfort as he climbed on behind Tom. The roar of the engines, the power beneath him, reminded him of a different kind of battle. As the bikers revved their engines and began their slow, deliberate ride through town, Bill held on tight. People on the sidewalks turned to watch, their eyes wide with curiosity. Some nodded in support, while others simply stared, unsure of what to make of the sight of an 84-year-old veteran riding into town with a gang of bikers at his side. The closer they got to Oakside Cafe, the more Bill's heart pounded. But he reminded himself why he was doing this, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced, belittled, or turned away because of the color of their skin. Today was about standing up, about making sure that Brunswick understood that things had to change. As they approached the cafe, Bill could already see a small crowd gathered. The bikers parked their motorcycles in a row, their presence both powerful and peaceful. Bill climbed off the bike, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him, but he held his head high. He wasn't here to be the center of attention. He was here to be part of something bigger. Tom stepped up beside him, his hand resting on Bill's shoulder. "You okay?" Bill nodded, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "I'm okay, Tom. Let's do this." The crowd outside Oakside Cafe had grown larger than Bill had expected. What had begun as a small gathering of veterans, bikers, and a few local townsfolk had swelled into something much more. People from all walks of life had come, young and old, black and white, men and women, each of them carrying signs or simply standing in silent solidarity. Bill felt his chest tighten with emotion at the sight. It was one thing to see the support of a few close friends, but this was something else entirely. Tom's bikers took their positions at the front of the protest, their leather jackets adorned with military patches and insignia that told the story of their service. They didn't say much, just stood, arms crossed, eyes scanning the growing crowd, a silent but imposing presence. Bill knew that their presence alone would keep things peaceful. No one wanted to pick a fight with these men. As Bill stood at the center of the gathering, he saw familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. Judy Thompson, the school teacher he had overheard the day before, was there with a group of other teachers, holding a sign that read, "Racism has no place here." Next to her was Reverend Samuel Harris, the pastor who had spoken with Bill the previous day. The Reverend's face was solemn, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. Bill also saw a group of younger people, students from the nearby high school who had come out in force. Many of them held homemade signs with messages like "Equality for All" and "Justice for Bill Harrison." Their energy was contagious. Their optimism was a stark contrast to the weariness Bill felt in his bones. They were the future, and for the first time in a long while, Bill felt a flicker of hope for what that future might hold. As the crowd continued to swell, Bill noticed that not everyone had come in support. Across the street, a small group of men stood watching, arms crossed, their expressions hard. Bill recognized Jim Wilcox among them, Lenny Davis's friend. Jim's face was a mask of disdain, and his presence was a reminder that not everyone in Brunswick was ready for change. But Bill wasn't here for Jim or for Lenny. He was here for himself and for the people who had come to stand beside him. At exactly 10 a.m., Reverend Harris stepped forward, his deep voice carrying easily over the crowd. "Thank you all for coming today," he began. "We are here in peace, to stand against hatred, to stand against discrimination. We are here for justice, not just for one man, but for all people in this community who have been made to feel unwelcome." The crowd responded with murmurs of agreement, the energy palpable. "This is not about anger," Reverend Harris continued. "This is about love. Love for one another, love for our town, and love for the future we want to build together." As the Reverend spoke, Bill felt a surge of pride. He had never been one for public displays, but standing here today, surrounded by people who believed in the same things he did, he felt a sense of belonging that had been missing for too long. The protest remained peaceful. The group marched slowly around the perimeter of the cafe, their signs held high, their voices calm but firm. Some chanted quietly, while others simply walked in silence. Bill stayed near the front, walking alongside Tom and the other bikers. His military jacket drew the attention of many in the crowd, a symbol of the sacrifice he had made for his country and the sacrifices that had yet to be fully recognized. Inside the cafe, Bill could see Lenny Davis through the window. The cafe owner was pacing behind the counter, his face twisted with anger and frustration. He hadn't come outside, but his presence was felt. Every now and then he would glare out at the protesters, his mouth moving as if he were talking to himself. But he didn't dare confront the crowd. As the morning wore on, more and more people joined the protest. Local reporters arrived, snapping photos and interviewing some of the participants. Bill wasn't interested in talking to the press. He let Reverend Harris and Tom handle that, but he knew the story would spread. Brunswick wasn't a large town, but news traveled fast, and this protest would make waves. At one point, Bill noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Kelly, the young waitress from Oakside Cafe, the one who had served him on that fateful day. She stood at the edge of the protest, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were unsure whether she should be there. Bill caught her eye, and she offered him a small, apologetic smile. Without thinking, Bill walked over to her, leaving Tom and the other bikers behind for a moment. "Kelly," he said softly as he approached. "Mr. Harrison," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know if I should come, but I'm so sorry for what happened. I didn't stand up for you when I should have." Bill looked into her young, earnest face and saw the guilt weighing heavily on her. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "You did what you could," he said, his gentle voice. "It wasn't your fault, but you're here now, and that means a lot." Kelly's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, relief washing over her features. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she whispered. "I'll do better. I promise." Bill gave her a warm smile before returning to the center of the protest. He didn't need Kelly's apology. He had never blamed her. But seeing her here today, standing with the protesters, was a sign that things could change. People could change. Just as the protest seemed to reach its peak, the front door of Oakside Cafe flew open with a loud bang. The crowd fell silent, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. Lenny Davis stood in the doorway, his face red with fury, his fists clenched at his sides. "What the hell is all this?" Lenny bellowed, his voice loud and grating. "You people think you can come here and ruin my business? This is my cafe. I have the right to serve who I want." The crowd stiffened, the tension rising immediately. Bill felt his heart sink as he watched Lenny stomp down the steps of the cafe, his eyes wild with anger. This was exactly what he had hoped to avoid, an open confrontation. But it seemed Lenny had finally reached his breaking point. Tom stepped forward, placing himself between Lenny and the crowd. His posture was calm, but there was no mistaking the protective stance he took. "Lenny, no one's here to fight you," Tom said evenly. "We're just here to protest what you did. We're not blocking your business. People can come and go as they please." Lenny's face contorted with rage. "You think this is going to do anything? You think you can scare me out of my own cafe?" Tom remained steady, his voice never rising. "No one's trying to scare you, Lenny, but people have a right to protest injustice, and that's what this is. We're not going anywhere until you understand that." Lenny's eyes darted around, searching for support, but the crowd remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Even Jim Wilcox, who had been standing across the street with his small group of supporters, stayed back, unwilling to step into the fray. Bill felt his pulse quicken, but he took a deep breath and stepped forward, standing beside Tom. "Lenny," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't about ruining your business. It's about making sure people like me, people like everyone in this town, are treated with the same respect. I fought for this country. I deserve to eat a meal in peace just like anyone else." For a moment, Lenny seemed to falter. His eyes flicked to Bill, and for just a split second, Bill thought he saw something: guilt, shame, maybe even regret. But it was quickly replaced by anger. Lenny spat on the ground at Bill's feet, his face twisted with hatred. "You don't belong here," he snarled. The words hung in the air like poison. The crowd gasped, and for a moment, it seemed like everything had stopped. The tension was unbearable. But then, something unexpected happened. One by one, people in the crowd began to move. They stepped forward, forming a protective circle around Bill, blocking Lenny's path. Tom stood at the front, his arms crossed, his eyes cold and hard. Judy Thompson, Reverend Harris, Kelly, and even some of the high school students stepped up beside him. "We all belong here," Tom said quietly, but his voice carried through the crowd like a wave. Lenny's face went white, his bluster finally failing him. He looked around, his eyes wild with confusion and anger, but there was no support for him here. Not now. He took a step back, his shoulders slumping, and without another word, he turned and stormed back into the cafe, slamming the door behind him. The crowd let out a collective breath, the tension breaking like a dam. Bill felt his knees tremble, but Tom's hand was on his shoulder, steadying him. "You're all right?" Tom asked quietly. Bill nodded, though his heart was still racing. "I'm all right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Tom." The protest continued for a while longer, but the mood had shifted. The crowd was no longer tense, it was filled with a quiet sense of victory. Lenny had been confronted, and while he hadn't admitted defeat, the town had made it clear that his behavior would not be tolerated. As the crowd began to disperse, Bill stood for a moment, watching as people gathered their signs and headed home. There was a sense of peace in the air now, a sense that things might finally begin to change. Bill wasn't sure what would happen next, whether Lenny would learn from this or dig his heels in even deeper, but for now he felt a sense of hope. He had stood up not just for himself, but for the entire town, and the town stood with him. The morning after the protest, Brunswick felt different. The air was still and quiet, but beneath that calm, a ripple of change was moving through the town. Bill Harrison sat at his kitchen table, staring out the window at the street below. The events of the previous day played on a loop in his mind. Lenny's, the quiet strength of the crowd, and the way people had rallied around him. He still couldn't quite believe it. For so long, Bill had faced these battles alone. He had stood his ground quietly, resisting with dignity, but he had never imagined so many would stand with him. The sight of the young high school students, the teachers, the bikers, and even Kelly had touched something deep within him. It gave him hope that maybe, just maybe, this town could change. As Bill sat there, his phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. He reached for the receiver and brought it to his ear. "Hello?" "Bill," came the familiar voice of Reverend Samuel Harris. "How are you holding up today?" Bill let out a small chuckle. "I'm all right, Reverend. Just still processing everything, I suppose." "I can imagine," Samuel said. His tone was warm. "I wanted to check in on you and also let you know something. After the protest, several people from the town council reached out to me. They're talking about setting up a meeting. They want to address what happened at Oakside Cafe and discuss how to prevent anything like that from happening again." Bill raised an eyebrow. His heart lifted slightly. "Is that right?" "Yes," Samuel confirmed. "It seems like yesterday really shook some people. They can't just sweep this under the rug anymore, not after everything that happened. The council knows that if they don't act, this town will be divided even further." Bill nodded, though Samuel couldn't see him. He could feel the significance of what Samuel was saying. The town council had never been quick to address racial issues in Brunswick, often allowing things to quietly fade away without any real resolution. But now, with the protest garnering attention and the story spreading, they couldn't ignore it. "That's good to hear," Bill said finally. "I don't know what'll come of it, but it's a start." Samuel's voice softened. "It's more than a start, Bill. You lit a fire yesterday, and now people are paying attention." As they finished their conversation, Bill hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair. He felt a surge of pride, but also a quiet sadness. It had taken so long, so many years of struggle, and he wondered if things could have been different if these conversations had started earlier. But he reminded himself that change was slow, especially in places like Brunswick. A few hours later, Bill decided to take a walk into town. He wasn't sure what to expect, whether people would treat him differently after the protest or if things would return to the quiet avoidance he had grown accustomed to over the years. But something inside him told him to go, to see for himself what, if anything, had changed. As he walked down the familiar streets, he noticed a few people waving or nodding at him as he passed. It was subtle, but there was a new sense of recognition in their gestures, a quiet acknowledgement that hadn't been there before. Bill wasn't naive enough to think that everyone in town had suddenly changed their minds about race or equality, but it was clear that something had shifted. When he reached the corner store, he ran into Judy Thompson, the school teacher who had attended the protest. She smiled warmly at him, stopping to chat. "Mr. Harrison, I'm so glad to see you out and about," she said, her tone genuine. "I just wanted to say how much yesterday meant to me, to all of us." Bill gave her a small smile. "I appreciate that, Judy. It meant a lot to me, too, seeing everyone there." She nodded, her eyes bright. "You know, some of the teachers and I have been talking. We're thinking about starting a diversity initiative at the school, something to help teach the students about racial equality and the history of civil rights. Yesterday really opened our eyes to how much work there is to do." Bill felt a lump form in his throat. That sounds like a good idea. The kids, they're the future. If we can teach them now, maybe they won't have to fight the same battles we've had to. Judy smiled again, her expression thoughtful. "Exactly. And I wanted to ask, would you be willing to come speak to the students one day? I think hearing your story, everything you've been through, would really resonate with them." Bill was taken aback by the request. He had never thought of himself as a public speaker, and the idea of standing in front of a classroom of students made him nervous. But at the same time, he knew how important it was. If his story could help even one young person understand the importance of equality, then it was worth it. "I'd be honored," Bill said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling inside him. Judy's face lit up. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I'll be in touch with the details." As Bill continued his walk, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. People were starting to talk. Conversations were happening that had been avoided for far too long, and while there was still so much work to be done, it felt like the town of Brunswick was finally taking a step in the right direction. While the town of Brunswick began to show signs of change, Lenny Davis was facing a very different reality. His actions at Oakside Cafe had not only caused a public outcry but had also resulted in a sharp decline in business. The cafe, once bustling with regulars, now sat mostly empty. Word had spread quickly about the protest, and many of Lenny's former customers had chosen to boycott the establishment. Bill hadn't set foot near Oakside Cafe since the protest, and he had no intention of doing so. But he had heard through the grapevine that Lenny was struggling. The townsfolk who had once turned a blind eye to his behavior were now avoiding the cafe, and even some of Lenny's closest friends had distanced themselves from him. The protest had put a spotlight on his actions, and there was no going back. One afternoon, Bill was sitting on his front porch when he saw a familiar figure walking up the street. It was Tom Jennings, the leader of the bikers, and he looked serious. Bill stood up to greet him as he approached. "Tom," Bill said with a nod. "Good to see you." "Good to see you too, Bill," Tom replied, though his expression was grim. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Bill raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" Tom scratched the back of his head, clearly choosing his words carefully. "It's about Lenny," he said finally. "Word around town is that he's looking to sell the cafe. Business has dried up and he's in over his head." Bill frowned, unsure of where Tom was going with this. "And some of the guys and I have been talking," Tom continued. "We're thinking about making him an offer, buying the cafe from him, turning it into something different, something better." Bill blinked in surprise. "You want to buy Oakside Cafe?" "Not exactly," Tom said with a shrug. We want to buy the space, turn it into a new cafe, a place where everyone is welcome. Veterans, families, black, white, it doesn't matter. We want it to be a place that represents the best of this town, not the worst." Bill was silent for a moment, processing what Tom was saying. The idea of Oakside Cafe being transformed into a place of inclusivity and community was almost too good to be true. It was the kind of poetic justice that Bill had never imagined. "And you want me involved?" Bill asked, though he already knew the answer. Tom smiled. "We wouldn't do it without you. It was your stand that started all of this. We want you to be part of the process, to help us build something better." Bill felt a surge of emotion well up inside him. After everything that had happened, the idea of turning Lenny's Cafe into a symbol of unity was more than he could have hoped for. It was a chance to create lasting change in Brunswick, to leave behind something positive for the next generation. "I'll do it," Bill said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Whatever you need, I'm in." Tom grinned, clapping Bill on the shoulder. That's what I wanted to hear. Several months later, the transformation of Oakside Cafe was complete. The building had undergone extensive renovations, and the entire space had been rebranded as the Patch and Stripe Cafe, a name chosen by Tom and the other veterans. The name was a nod to their military backgrounds, and the new cafe was designed to be a place where everyone, veterans, civilians, families, could come together. On the day of the grand reopening, the town of Brunswick turned out in droves. The cafe was bustling with life, the air filled with the scent of fresh coffee and homemade pastries. The new staff was diverse, reflecting the very community the cafe was built to serve. There was an undeniable sense of excitement and hope in the air, a feeling that something new and important had taken root in the town. Bill was there, of course. He had been given the honor of being the first customer to walk through the doors of the new Patch and Stripe Cafe. As he stepped inside, he was greeted with cheers and applause from the crowd. His heart swelled with emotion, and for a moment, he was overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what had been accomplished. Tom stood beside him, a broad smile on his face. "What do you think, Bill?" he asked, his voice filled with pride. Bill looked around the cafe, taking in the lively atmosphere, the smiling faces, and the sense of community that filled the room. "It's more than I ever could have imagined," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The Patch and Stripe Cafe was more than just a place to eat. It was a symbol of the town's progress, of the stand Bill had taken and the way the community had rallied around him. It represented the idea that change was possible, even in a small town like Brunswick, where old prejudices had once run deep. As Bill sat down at a table, a young waitress came over to take his order. She wore a small pin on her apron that read, "Equality serves everyone." Bill smiled at the sight of it, knowing that it wasn't just a slogan, it was a commitment. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," the waitress said warmly. "What can I get for you today?" Bill chuckled, glancing down at the menu. "I think I'll start with a cup of coffee," he said, "and maybe some scrambled eggs." The waitress nodded and quickly left to place his order. Bill sat back in his chair watching as the cafe buzzed with activity. Families sat at tables, veterans exchanged stories, and young people sipped coffee as they worked on laptops or chatted with friends. As he looked around, Bill spotted Kelly, the former Oakside waitress, now working happily at the new cafe. She caught his eye and waved, her face bright with a smile. Bill waved back, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Tom walked over and sat down across from Bill, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "Here you go," he said with a grin. "On the house." Bill picked up the cup and took a sip, savoring the rich, familiar taste. It was the taste of home, of community, of belonging. "What do you say we make toast?" Tom asked, raising his own cup. Bill raised his mug, nodding in agreement. What are we toasting to? Tom smiled, his eyes sweeping over the bustling cafe. To new beginnings and to standing up for what's right. Bill nodded, his heart full. And to a future where everyone feels welcome. Their mugs clinked together, the sound ringing out clearly above the hum of conversation and laughter that filled the cafe. It was a small moment, but it represented something much larger, the power of community, the strength found in unity, and the change that could happen when people came together to stand against injustice. As Bill sat there, surrounded by the warmth and life of the new cafe, he felt a profound sense of hope. The Patch and Stripe Cafe had become more than just a place to get breakfast. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people stood together for what was right. Bill looked around the cafe one more time, his eyes filled with gratitude. Brunswick had come a long way, and though there was still work to be done, today felt like a victory. Not just for him, but for the entire town. For the first time in a long time, Bill felt like he truly belonged. It had been 6 months since the grand reopening of the Patch and Stripe Cafe, and Brunswick was still buzzing from the transformation. What had once been a small, quiet town, where people avoided talking about difficult issues, was now a community in the midst of change. The cafe had become a gathering place for conversations that once seemed impossible. People from different walks of life sat together, shared meals, and talked openly about their experiences. It wasn't perfect. There were still those who resisted change, but the progress was undeniable. For Bill Harrison, life had taken on a new rhythm. Each day he would walk to the cafe, not as an act of defiance, but as a reminder to himself and others that he belonged there. He would order his coffee and scrambled eggs, sit in his favorite booth by the window, and watch the town pass by. It was a simple routine, but one that filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. As Bill sat in the cafe one afternoon, sipping his coffee, he heard the soft chime of the bell above the door. He looked up and smiled when he saw Kelly approach him with a stack of letters in her hand. "Mr. Harrison," she said with a grin, placing the pile on the table, "it looks like you've got some mail." Bill raised an eyebrow, glancing at the small mountain of envelopes in front of him. "All of this for me?" he asked, surprised. Kelly nodded. "It's been coming in steadily since the reopening. People from all over have been writing to you." Bill's heart swelled as he stared at the letters. He hadn't realized how far his story had reached. The protest, the cafe's transformation, and the town's journey toward healing had been covered by local and national news outlets. People from across the country had heard about what had happened in Brunswick, and it seemed they had been moved to reach out. Bill picked up the first envelope, carefully opening it. The letter inside was handwritten, the penmanship neat and precise. As he read, his heart ached in the best way possible. "Dear Mr. Harrison, I read about what happened at Oakside Cafe, and I just wanted to say how much your story has inspired me. I'm a young black man and I've struggled with feeling like I don't belong in certain spaces. But seeing the way you stood up for yourself and for what's right has given me hope. Thank you for your courage. You've made a difference, not just in your town, but in the lives of people like me. With gratitude, Marcus W., Chicago, Illinois." Bill put the letter down, his eyes misting over. He hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. He had just wanted to have breakfast in peace, but knowing that his actions had inspired others filled him with a sense of pride and responsibility. He continued to read through the letters, each one filled with words of admiration, gratitude, and hope. There were letters from young people, from veterans, from people who had faced their own struggles with discrimination. Some shared their personal stories of hardship, while others simply thanked Bill for being a beacon of strength and dignity. As he reached the last letter in the stack, Bill noticed the familiar handwriting on the envelope. His heart skipped a beat as he carefully opened it, revealing a letter from his granddaughter, Leah. Dear Grandpa, I saw the news about the cafe and the protest, and I couldn't be prouder of you. You've always been my hero. But seeing you stand up for what's right in such a public way, it's inspiring. You've shown me that we should never stop fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes or how hard it is. I've been thinking a lot about what I can do to make a difference in my own community. I want to carry on the legacy you've built. I've joined a local group that focuses on racial equality and social justice, and we've started having conversations at school about how to create a more inclusive environment for students of all backgrounds. You've taught me that change starts with one person standing up, and I want to be that person here. I love you, Grandpa. You've always taught me to be strong and to stand up for what I believe in. I just hope I can make as much of a difference in the world as you have. With all my love. Leah. Bill's hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter, his eyes filled with unshed tears. Leah had always been his pride and joy, but knowing that his actions had inspired her to take her own stand filled him with a deep, overwhelming sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future. And the fact that his granddaughter was carrying that torch forward gave him more hope than anything else. Just as Bill was tucking the letter back into the envelope, Tom Jennings walked into the cafe, his usual confident stride carrying him to Bill's table. Mind if I join you? Tom asked, already pulling out a chair. Bill smiled and gestured for him to sit. Of course, Tom. Tom settled in, ordering a coffee from Kelly before turning his attention back to Bill. How's life treating you these days, Bill? Bill chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. I'd say life is pretty good, Tom. Pretty good. Tom grinned. Glad to hear it. You've earned it. He took a sip of his coffee, his expression turning thoughtful. You know, I've been thinking about something. This cafe, it's become more than just a place for breakfast. It's a symbol. A reminder of what can happen when people stand together. Bill nodded, glancing around the bustling cafe. It has, but there's still work to be done. Always, Tom agreed. But I think we've shown that change is possible, even in a town like Brunswick. Bill smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you and your crew, Tom. You all stood by me when I needed it most. Tom waved his hand dismissively. We were just following your lead, Bill. You're the one who had the courage to take that first step. As the two men sat in comfortable silence, Bill couldn't help but think about the journey that had led him here. He had faced so much in his life: war, discrimination, heartbreak, but he had never given up. And now, sitting in this cafe, surrounded by people who believed in the same things he did, he knew that his fight had not been in vain. The Patch and Stripe Cafe had become a symbol of resilience, of unity, and of the power of community. It was a place where people came to share meals, exchange stories, and work toward a future where everyone was treated with respect and dignity. And Bill knew that while his personal battles might be behind him, the legacy of what he had helped build would live on for generations. As Bill and Tom chatted, the cafe door opened once again and a group of young people walked in, laughing and talking excitedly. Bill recognized a few of them as high school students who had attended the protest months earlier. They waved at him as they passed, and Bill waved back, a warm smile on his face. The world was changing slowly but surely, and Bill was grateful to be a part of it. Later that evening, as Bill sat on his porch watching the sun set over Brunswick, he thought about the future. He thought about Leah and the work she was doing in her own community. He thought about the letters he had received, the people he had touched without even realizing it. And he thought about the cafe, the place where he had once been turned away, but which now stood as a testament to the strength of standing up for what's right. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, Bill felt a profound sense of peace. He had fought his battles, and while the fight for justice would continue, he knew that he had done his part. He took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. And as he sat there, bathed in the quiet of the night, he smiled. The road ahead might still be long, but for the first time in a long time, Bill Harrison was filled with hope. If this story of courage, community, and standing up against injustice inspired you, don't miss out on more powerful narratives like this one. Click subscribe to stay updated and be part of a journey toward positive change and hope for a better future.